I know for many of us, outdoor worship and even Zoom worship can be so challenging. It can be uncomfortable in the heat. The birds can be sometimes beautiful, sometimes distracting, liturgies in our hand, umbrellas in the other hand. But this too will pass. And we're so grateful to the team that comes every Sunday morning to set up. You know who you are, and we're so grateful for all the hard work that goes on to get here every Sunday morning. But come away with me for a moment. Come away from this patio area to the ocean. I want you to imagine you're out on a boat in the ocean, or maybe even just going for a swim, way, way out far, and you keep going out and out and out, till that moment when you look back and the shore is so distant, you no longer recognize the familiar landmarks. And then you turn around and you look ahead and you can't see anything in front of you either, nothing to guide you. And you have that feeling of disorientation, where all the bearings are gone. There's this desperate need inside you to have some kind of clear marker, some clear guideline, but it's just not there. It's easy to panic. It's easy to slip into despair, feeling overwhelmed. It's easy to get stuck and tread water. This past week, I signed up to the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity's prayer journey. Every so often, they put out an invitation to join 40 days of prayer. And this time, their theme is transitions, which I felt was so appropriate for what we're experiencing as a congregation. And the big idea is that during transitions, faith can grow. This is the opportunity for our faith to mature, to get larger. Whether the transition is a loss of someone or a loss of something, whether it's a transition to a new way of life, like the way the pandemic has come to us, not with our choosing. And the prayer journey is marked into 4 distinct phases in the transition. First of all, the signal of change, that change is about to come. Then secondly, the ending of a former way of life. The third stage is disorientation. And the final stage is reorientation. And I wonder if you resonate with that feeling of disorientation, where you know you're trying to get into this new, better way, but you're just not quite there yet. I wonder if this story that we read can help us today, the story from 1 Samuel 17. Normally we shrink this story nice and neatly into a children's tale of the giant and the little boy. But when you take time to read the 58 verses in this chapter, you see something important is happening here. The narrator wouldn't take 58 verses just to pass over a little story. There's something significant going on in the story, not just of David's life, but the story of God's people, Israel. The Israelites are in a phase of disorientation. They had signaled change a little while earlier. They wanted a king. They wanted a monarchy. They were moving out of the period of the judges. But that little phrase, so that we can be like other nations, is rumbling on in the back of their minds. And so this is a pivotal chapter in 1 Kings. Is it true that the people can live authentically as people of God? Are they simply wanting security, just like all the other nations surrounding them? And it seems that they've got stuck. They're disoriented. It seems that that divine identity is dissolving. They're in a 40-day test. It says for 40 days, they get up, they go out, they see Goliath, then they go back to their tents again, day after day after day, because this giant Goliath is dominating their thinking. This giant is their sea, it's their ocean. They're stuck, they can't see ahead, they can't see behind. And they're tired. They've been doing this for 40 days and they don't know how to get unstuck again. This has been one long, drawn-out test, surrounded by their enemies, the Philistines. And even though it's only this one person who's goading them, this giant has overwhelmed them with fear. They no longer know where they've come from and where they're going to. And so demoralized and despairing are they with their disorientation. This is how it manifests in their behavior. They cover it up with details. They're murmuring. Do you notice how this giant keeps coming out to defy Israel? They're giving this narrative, covering it up. Do you see how much the king has promised to give us a reward of wealth, the daughter's hand in marriage, exemption from taxes, all these wonderful incentives to beat the giant? And they keep saying it over and over again to David, to anyone they meet, but it doesn't get them unstuck. Because the sea of disorientation is larger than any incentive to get them out and pull them out of it. Eugene Peterson calls this disease Philistine realism. I wonder if a better term might be Philistine moralism, because you see the people digging in to try and describe the situation, just how bad things are. They try and assess all that they need to do in order to get out of the situation. And even when David does face Saul, Saul tries to kit him out with this armor to try and match Goliath. Oh, we see this worthy opponent in Goliath, so let's make sure we've the right strategy in place and dignify his presence with at least a well-matched opponent and a well-matched reward. That's realism and moralism. That's crushing because it's motivated by fear. That we are not enough to overcome the presence of evil in this world. Peterson says the moment we permit evil to control and dominate our imaginations, to dictate the way we think and shape our responses, we at the same time become incapable of seeing good, of seeing beauty, of seeing truth. Does that describe you today, where something is so dominant in your life, it makes you incapable of seeing the good, the true, and the beautiful? After one long year, are you disoriented, stuck in a place, and you try to keep on describing the place you're in, you try to keep adding on ways to get out of that place, but the sea is large, and your boat is little. I wonder if any of you have seen the 1989 movie called Rain Man. It's a movie our family loves. We return to it quite a bit. The story of two brothers, Charlie and Raymond Babbitt. And when the ambitious car dealer, Charlie Babbitt, who's played by Tom Cruise, learns that his father has died, he returns to his home in Cincinnati, even though his father was estranged, it was a very difficult relationship. He goes home. He's feeling that yearning to go home. And he discovers that he had a brother all these years that he never knew about, this autistic older brother named Raymond, who's played by Dustin Hoffman. And he discovers that his father's $3 million fortune is not being left to himself, to Charlie, but it's being left to the mental institution in which Raymond lives. And Charlie is motivated by this reward. And he checks Raymond out of the facility that he lives in, and he tries to win Raymond over in friendship. But on this journey, there's just so many insurmountable challenges. Raymond doesn't like to get in a plane, doesn't like flying. Raymond's life centers around specific rhythms in the day, certain TV shows that must be played at certain times. The maple syrup must be on the table before the waffles arrive. And it's this fascinating insight into a highly controlled environment that Raymond lives in. But here's the thing. All that Raymond is doing is holding up this mirror to the tightly controlled life that Charlie has had. Someone who struggles to have any type of healthy relationships. Someone who's swallowed up by the evil and domination of money. Charlie is the one who's trying to make Raymond fit into his world when into a place he was never designed to fit. It shows up Charlie, not Raymond. Charlie for all his failings. It's not Raymond who's the limited one, the movie reveals. It's Charlie who needs transformation the most. Because Raymond's world, though socially limited, is wonderful. It has this huge capacity for numbers, for memorizing phone books, for noticing sequences of little codes on the music jukebox, or whether it's bigger ideas like the number of crashes that certain airlines have had over their lifetime. Raymond's world is huge. Charlie's world is small. And by going on this cross-country trip together, Charlie Babbitt's life is broken open and it's changed and transformed. When the Israelites stand in front of Goliath, what's happening here is the Philistines are merely holding up the mirror to the Israelites, to what they have become. Their lives have become only as good as the nameless gods that the Philistines are trying to summon against them. They're trying to match might with might. And the Philistine phobia is just so dominant in the Israelites' lives that when the true hero David shows up, his brother Eliab, instead of recognizing the potential for change and transformation, Eliab simply turns to David and says, "Go back home, little brother. You're being irresponsible. You should be minding the sheep." Do you see that? Do you see the moralism that's creeping in? It's seen in how Saul behaves, and Eliab, how he behaves, and so many others in the story. But through David, there emerges another way, a way removed from the Philistine moralism. It's the way of aggressive optimism. David steps on the scene and he notices what his brothers notices. He sees this giant, but rather than interpreting it as a sea of disorientation, he interprets it with aggressive optimism. Eliab and Saul see the size and power of their opponent. David sees it differently. He says, "Who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" All the time the Israelites had been caught up in the reputation of Goliath, when all the while they should have been worrying about the reputation of their God, the living God. For the Israelites, Goliath had dominated their thinking. How are we going to get rid of him? What is it going to take? But David, like a breath of fresh air, lets the living God dominate his thinking. Up until now, the Israelites thought and breathed Goliath as if God was dead, Now David was going to challenge his own people to start thinking and breathing the living God again so that the giant could be dead. And nowhere is this more evident than when he goes to Saul. There's a neat little moment happening here, because when you go to the king or the queen, you're in their court. It's up to them to speak and initiate the conversation. Normal etiquette would suggest that the king starts, but it's David who begins by saying, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine." Do you see that? There's a reversal happening. David is soothing the king. It should have been the other way around. But in this moment, you see the anointed one stepping in, the anointed one opening the way to that thin place of heaven and earth, acting like the spiritual midwife to Israel. And when David has to prove himself with this self-credentialing story of how the lions and the bears were all put to death, I'm sure any boy of that age would have embellished the story. The size of the paws were this big. But not David. That's not his story. It's all about God. He says, when God delivered me from the paws of the bear and the lion, it gives me faith that God can do it again. God can deliver me again. You see, David, with every breath, with every fiber of his being, is resuscitating the memory of God, the living God, the rescuer God, the Yahweh God, resuscitating this memory into the minds of the people who'd forgotten. And once David begins to talk to Saul in this way, do you see how for the first time we hear on Saul's lips the name Yahweh being mentioned again? Up until now, Yahweh hasn't featured until David brings him in. David was a small boy, but he had a large hope, because what mattered to him was the name of God. Goliath had blasphemed God. It didn't matter that David had left his sheep. It didn't matter that Saul's armor didn't fit him properly. It didn't matter he wasn't the correct age to go and fight. All that mattered was that God's name was being taken in vain. And so he gets down on his knees and he picks up these stones. These are not militarized weapons. They're just stones. But I wonder, as his gaze went into his hand and into these small stones, was he honoring the memory of Yahweh's command that anyone who blasphemes the living God should be what? Stoned. We don't know how historically penetrating David's insight is, but we do know that David has a realization that this story will get legs and it will travel. It's going to be told again and again and again. And so he makes sure it's heard, not just to his people, but to us today. He says, all those gathered here today will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. The battle is the Lord's. So as we hear this story, for you, what sea of disorientation are you in today? Something as signal change is afoot for you, moving on to a new stage of life. Maybe the loss of a job, finding a new one, the loss of a loved one, the loss of an old way of life, and you're transitioning with that sense of disorientation. The Eliab and Saul way to deal with it is to let Philistine phobia stress you out so that you're trying to measure, control everything, even the things you can't control. You're like Charlie Babbitt trying to put others in boxes they were never intended to fit. This way robs you of the presence of God. because the fear of the sea is greater than the God in the boat. The David way is to find your place in the story. Instead of clutching on to all the details of armor you think you need for this journey, it's to let go and instead recognize where true power comes from. The living, resurrected Jesus Christ. Years later, when the disciples were out in a boat in a storm, the sea seemed so large and menacing. The storm was great. The boat seemed small. And it took the greater David, Jesus, to awake and calm the storm in their lives. And whatever you're bringing to worship this morning, know that Jesus is in the boat with you. And Jesus came to defeat the greatest giant of all, death, so that nothing should have this kind of hold on your life that's choking you. You should be free. And I wonder, through our transitions, have we lost God? Have you lost that sense of God living and breathing and moving and guiding and directing and giving you life? Maybe it's time to lay down some of that armor and instead pick up the bread and wine in your hand and see it as the living stone of Jesus Christ. That's aggressive optimism. Aggressive optimism is not my phrase. It's a phrase that's coined by a man, a Scottish man called George MacLeod. And this past week, people were celebrating his birthday. He's long gone. He was born 126 years ago. But when George was fighting in the trenches of World War I, he was out in no man's land and the shells were flying, and by some miracle or against the odds, he got out and was able to get back into his own trenches, where he marked with aggressive optimism to his friends, sure, it could have been worse. At least it wasn't raining. And his friends were so struck by this attitude, they later mock court-martialed him on this charge of aggressive optimism. But years later, it was this aggressive optimism that built a center of worship in the Iona Island. Even though there was no electricity, no running water, it was slightly crazy. But what mattered to him was the presence of God. And MacLeod founded the Iona community as a way of encouraging the presence of God to mark people's lives, to dominate their lives. And this vision was so large that in 1989, he won the Templeton Prize. And with this money, he set up a grant scheme for those who demonstrated the same aggressive optimism for peacemaking. And today, those grants are still available. If you've an idea about how to be aggressively optimistic for God, there's a grant. Philistine moralism, aggressive optimism. In this long chapter, the narrator stands in the middle at this pivot point for the nation of Israel. And the narrator describes how the Israelites changed direction through the power of a single faith-filled life who believed that God was great, God was living, God can do the impossible. Today we have the opportunity to do the same, to reorient to the greater David. That's why we come to worship. Henry Nouwen says our lives are not problems to be fixed, but journeys to be taken with Jesus as our friend and our finest guide. So in a moment, come to the table, lay your armor down, lay the things down that are getting you stuck, and instead simply hold the bread and wine as tokens of what gives you true, free, healthy life. And may you reorient in a way that brings life to others in an aggressively optimistic, beautiful, truthful, life-giving way. So come and worship the living God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.